Well, President Obama has said the United States strongly condemns yesterday's violence against civilians and would cancel joint military exercises with Egypt planned for next month. He's also just called for the immediate lifting of the state of emergency that's been declared here. As for the European Union, foreign ministers are to meet next week to discuss the crisis, but there is a real question about why the international community has been slow to rein in the role of the Egyptian military. Our international editor, Lyndsey Hilsum, reports on the diplomatic dilemma the world faces, and again, I must warn you, her report contains distressing images.
What to do when your close ally starts killing its own citizens?
While we want to sustain our relationship with Egypt, our traditional cooperation cannot continue as usual when civilians are being killed in the streets and rights are being rolled back.
So the president announced the cancellation of annual joint military exercises next month. A gesture, not a policy, said a former diplomat. The US gives $1.3 billion in military aid to Egypt every year, but that won't be withdrawn because America fears jeopardizing Egypt's peace treaty with Israel. Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the most powerful man in Egypt. The US Defense Secretary reportedly begged him not to unleash the security forces on the Muslim Brotherhood supporters. His entreaties were not only ignored, but seen as evidence of US support for the Brotherhood. Today, Brotherhood supporters took to the streets of Alexandria, protesting against the brutality of the security forces. They blame America for failing to defend their elected president, Mohamed Morsi. President Obama may feel he can't win.
We've been blamed by supporters of Morsi. We've been blamed by the other side as if we are supporters of Morsi. That kind of approach will do nothing to help Egyptians achieve the future that they deserve.
The Turkish Prime Minister, sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, expressed his frustration.
I'm calling on Western countries. You remain silent on Palestine, Gaza. You remain silent on Syria. You are still silent on Egypt. So how come you talk about democracy, freedom, global values and human rights?
In London today, the Egyptian ambassador was telling journalists that the Muslim Brotherhood were armed and that justified the security forces' attacks. He was summoned to the Foreign Office for a rebuke, but that appears to have had little effect. Muslim Brotherhood supporters have attacked symbols of the state, including the local council building in Alexandria. But the state in Egypt remains strong and seemingly impervious to Western pressure. Maybe that's because Gulf countries recently provided $12 million, 10 times annual US aid. And they've said nothing about the Egyptian government's attacks on its own citizens.
Well, with me now is Khaled Dawoud, spokesman for the National Salvation Front. That's a coalition of opposition parties who are broadly supportive of this current interim regime. And Heba Morayef is Egypt Director of Human Rights Watch. And you spent much of the last day seeing exactly what has gone on. Has it been a crime? Has this been a crime against humanity?
I wouldn't go as far necessarily as a crime against humanity, but what we know is that yesterday crimes were committed. Innocent people were killed. Force was used unlawfully by the police when it moved in to break up the sit-in. And we're now looking at a death toll of perhaps only more than 400 for the Rab'a sit-in alone.
And you support it?
No, I don't think anybody can support killing innocent Egyptians. Of course, we're not happy that any blood was being shed. At the same time, we still hold the Muslim Brotherhood responsible for this escalation because for 48 days they totally disregarded the repeated calls to break the sit-in, which was in the middle of a residential area.
So it was their fault?
It's not their fault, but I'm just saying that this was a gradual result of calls for martyrdom that were being urged by the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood group, appeals that they should confront the police.
What do you make of that analysis, Heba Morayef?
Well, I think Mohammed al-Baradei put it in the right way. There were alternatives, and because his advice wasn't listened until he resigns.
He's the vice president who has resigned. Who's your boss?
Yes.
And you are now at odds with him.
Well, as when he became the vice president, he suspended his membership as the president of the Dastur party that I belong to. But at the same time, I cannot, of course, except agree with his point of view that more time should have been given to any chance to solve political differences. But there was at least another camp within Egypt, a lot of Egyptians who don't think that negotiations with the Brotherhood after 48 days would have brought any results, and that's probably the camp that won at the end of the day.
So ultimately, do you think Egypt is in a better place today than it was?
Not at all. Again, I agree with Dr. Baradei. If there was any chance to save Egyptian lives, we should have used it. I'm very worried about the future. I can see attacks on churches in South Egypt, more attacks on government buildings. Unfortunately, as he mentioned in his resignation letter, we're heading towards probably, unfortunately, more polarization and more kind of conflict in the coming
Morayef,
days.
this is exactly what you warned of 6 weeks ago when we spoke to you, when there was this popular military coup.
Yes, and I think, we were all warning against the forcible dispersal of the citizen because the high death toll would itself set Egypt on a path where a whole set of other measures, and you can't really imagine including the Brotherhood in Egypt's political future, and what kind of elections can Egypt have without the Brotherhood, the most organized
So how do you save
running?
the situation?
Look, I don't think human rights people can save the situation. All we can say right now is that the police needs to be reined back. The decision today that the Ministry of Interior is saying that the police will be allowed to use live ammunition is a recipe for further disaster. Enough blood has been shed, and we need to see the police also intervene effectively to protect churches.
Are you going to rein the police back? Are you going to call for them to be reined back?
Of course, we have repeatedly called for the police to be reined back. We do not actually have any trust as NSF in the current Interior Ministry. He has a long record, even under Morsi. He was appointed by Morsi in suppressing human rights and in killing human rights activists and even peaceful demonstrators sometimes during the year that Morsi was in office. But again, let me insist that a lot of Egyptians do not see what happened as a military coup. We went out on big numbers on June 30, about 20 million people who went and demanded Morsi's ouster. The army sided with the people.
And you don't want the army reined back either?
When you keep on saying it was a military coup, this means you're expecting the army to shoot at the people who came out on June 30, and that would have not been proper.
Military coup is used by those people who say this wouldn't have happened without the military.
I mean, I will continue to give the Egyptian army so far the benefit of the doubt that they will remain committed to the roadmap that they promised us to lead us to a new round of elections. Of course, practices
Just last word,
practices like what happened do not help. I do not support the killing of innocent civilians.
Do the army deserve the benefit of the doubt?
No, I think the army need to be held to Egypt's human rights obligations. We had a year and a half of army rule where they killed unarmed protesters and violated a number of other human rights. And there is no reason why the army should be given a blank check at this point. Whether you believe it was a coup or not, the army has to be held to account and has to be investigated for the crimes that it itself has committed.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining us tonight. Well, later on in the programme, we'll be speaking to representatives from the EU and the US State Department. But for now, back to you in London, Kathy.